Welcome to Powering the Future Within, the podcast where we explore the breakthroughs shaping the future of MedTech. I'm Omari Bouknight, CEO of Resonant Link Medical. Each episode, we speak with a leader who is driving the next wave of medical innovation, advancing technologies that are smarter, less invasive, and more connected than ever before. This is where the future of health takes shape. Let's dive in. Today's guest is Dr. Bill Hunter, President, CEO, and Chief Medical Officer of Canary Medical, where he is pioneering a new generation of intelligent implantable medical devices that combine advanced sensors, data, and artificial intelligence to transform patient care. Dr. Hunter is one of MedTech's most accomplished physician entrepreneurs. Over the course of his career, he has founded and led companies responsible for some of the industry's most influential innovations, while helping shape how breakthrough technologies are developed, commercialized, and adopted around the world. Today, through Canary Medical, he is helping redefine what an implant can do by enabling devices to continuously generate meaningful clinical insights long after they leave the operating room. Bill, welcome to Powering the Future Within.
Thanks for having me.
Really excited to have you here. Very much a topic I think that our audience will enjoy hearing. I'm curious, if you were to think about when you finished medical training back in the 1990s, would the people around you, your colleagues at that time, would they have predicted a career for you that centered more on innovation rather than traditional clinical practice?
No, not at all. I really been in love with medicine since I can remember. And as hokey as it sounds, I don't think I ever wanted to do anything else. And so I was incredibly excited to, be a doc and travel the traditional medical course. And ended up in this line of work, by accident, not by design. So I think most people would be pretty surprised that I ended up, in a completely different direction than where I started.
Was it a particular occasion or something that triggered your interest in moving more towards innovation?
No, I was 100% accidental entrepreneur. um, so I was a less than stellar undergrad. And so I went to graduate school as a way to make up for the ills of my youth and try and get into medical school. And so I went to a graduate program at the University of British Columbia. And anyways, long story short, the work that I had done in graduate school led directly to what became the Texas stent and the drug-coated stent and what ultimately became Angiotech. And so while I was in medical school, because I went to medical school also at the University of British Columbia, so I continued my research during medical school, and we started a company. Uh, we really only did that because it was way easier to get money through matching kind of corporate government grants than it was to go to a major granting agency and get a grant. And my I was I didn't have a great academic lineage, and I was never going to compete for NIH grants and stuff like that. So we honestly we set this company up as a way to fund the research that we were doing and to make these drug-coated stents. Um, and the plan had been to just continue on and go into medicine. And I woke up one day and the darn thing actually worked. I mean, the animal studies that we had done were successful, and we'd done a couple of human patients, and they were successful. And I took a year off, which became 2 years off, and so one day I just woke up and it had consumed my medical career. But it was completely accidental. It was completely not by design, and I just kind of went with the flow. I lacked career planning, I guess, and that's how I ended up in this business.
How did you manage to balance medical school while building a company, while conducting research? It seems like three things that occupy someone's full day alone.
Yeah, I was lucky. I was the graduate program I was in was the Department of Anatomy at UBC, and as a result of that, I had taken a bunch of the kind of heavy courses that you take in medical school as well, like gross anatomy and neuroanatomy and histology. I'd already taken them, and so I actually was able to kind of TA during the first part of my medical school because I had a lower caseload when I went into medical school, and so I was able to kind of balance both. And I've always loved research. I'm totally into it. I had planned my whole life to have been an academic clinician. Like I never doubted that I want to be involved in research. I just never thought that I would solely end up on the other side of it. And so I was able to balance it as I went through. When I interned and did other things, it got a little bit more complicated as the hours got longer, but it was, it just kind of all worked out. And I had great support. I had co-founders who were exceptional scientists, and it was actually kind of ironic that it was the medical student who ended up being the CEO. I was definitely the least qualified of my founding group, but I was also the only one who didn't have a day job. So that's how I think I ended up in the position because my other founders were university professors and an interventional radiologist, and they had real jobs and were making a real living. So I was the one who had the spare time, quotation marks, to pursue this business idea.
Different type of a short straw, I suppose.
Yeah, it really was. Yeah, it was more the, everybody takes one step back when they were looking for volunteers, and I think it's kind of how it turned out.
So you're conducting this, and we often see in medtech a gap between what's
Mhm.
technology, what's impressive from a technology perspective, versus what actually fits clinical reality. Did you find it helpful to be going through medical school as you evaluated drug-eluting stents?
Yeah, I truly did. And now I'm at the other end of my career. I have a lot of people who ask advice about stuff like that, and the one thing I will say about medicine is it's a wonderful grounding. Like if you're going to have a background, it's really helpful. The PhD programs are outstanding, and I've worked with great PhDs. I won't say limitation, but the issue with a PhD program is that you tend to be incredibly focused in one specific area. And obviously my graduate training was like that as well. But in medicine, you have this incredible breadth. You don't know a ton about anything, but you know a lot about everything. And so it's really helpful. And as you get into, development and have to learn about toxicity, well, you know how the liver works and you know how, the organ systems work. And so it really is this wonderful, diverse background that allows you to have an idea of what's going on. And secondly, particularly if you spend time in clinical medicine like I did, I did practice for a while. You realize what is practical and what isn't. People come forward with ideas and they're like, "Oh, I've got this great treatment and we just have to deliver it intrathecally, 5 times a week." And you're like, "Yeah, that's just never going to work. Doesn't matter how successful the outcomes are, that's just not practical from a clinical perspective." So I also think it gives you a grounding as to, it kind of reality bases you as to what will actually be practical in a hospital or clinical setting that, may not be apparent if you haven't, you know, spent time in that environment.
Right, right. The clinical realities of the practicalities of applying some of these technologies are really important. So if you go back to that animal lab, you come out of the lab, you're seeing that the drug-eluting stent seems to be working in your
Mhm.
animal evaluations, and of course, we're talking about using drug-eluting stents for the indication of coronary artery disease. Drug-eluting stents would go on to become one of those very rare medtech innovations that achieved massive adoption almost immediately after approval. Coming
Yes.
out of those animal labs, did you have a sense at that time of how profound the impact could be?
No, there definitely was an aha moment, but it came much later. It came after the big clinical studies. Um, but kind of a fun fact going back to at that time and place, uh, coronary stents, when we started working on drug-coated stents weren't actually approved yet for coronary use. And they had been approved for biliary stenting. And the size of the biliary tract was roughly the same size as the kind of main branch coronary arteries, the so-called Benestent lesions, were about the same size as the common bile duct. And so people were using biliary stents in the coronary system to try and do that. And so we were working on drug-coated stents a couple of years before coronary stents were actually approved, much less drug-coated stents. And so early on, it seemed quite futuristic. It seemed a long way away because, the platform hadn't been improved yet, much less the new and improved platform. Having said that, though, we were hardly the only people in the world who were focused on that. There were other groups who were doing really great work as well, but, it seemed very far off. But the nice thing about it is that the pig models in coronary stenting are fairly predictive of the human models, at least with respect to restenosis, not always with respect to coronary artery disease, but with respect to the scarring and restenosis, aspect of it. If you can get it to work in a pig, you have a reasonable probability that it will work in man, although, not 100% for sure. But, once we had those, that data was interesting enough to the big players in the game, which were, Medtronic and Guidant and J&J and Boston Scientific, for them to take an interest because, the cost step up in coronary stenting going from an animal model to, large scale human studies was hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Well beyond our capability. So that was an important stepping stone. But so many things had failed to transition in man that I don't think we really knew what we had until we had the first human studies.
Well, and I'm also curious. It's a really important insight that at that time, coronary stents, bare metal stents, had not been approved. So as you kind of look into the future and you see the difference in performance between drug-eluting stents and bare metal stents, it's really about reducing the amount of restenosis. So again, we're talking about coronary artery disease. With bare metal stents, one of the challenges really was there's a high proportion of patients that would see stenosis or restenosis through the stent of the coronary arteries. And eventually what we saw over time is that drug-eluting stents perform better because of the drugs essentially reducing the amount of restenosis, so therefore reducing the amount of recurrent coronary artery disease. So I'm curious if you didn't have if you didn't have bare metal stents in the market for coronary artery disease, what was the thinking around how drug-eluting stents might be better? Because we didn't really have definitive data at that point, right?
Yeah, a cardiologist once said to me that the interesting thing about the evolution of interventional cardiology is that we kept creating new problems that had to be solved. So every generation of device created a new clinical problem that required a new clinical solution. So, obviously angioplasty balloons came first, and they were great. They could, open up an artery that was closed. But they created a new problem, which was called acute closure. So when I was early in my training, code blue to the cath lab was a really common occurrence, because when you'd crack the artery open with the balloon, when you'd withdraw the balloon, sometimes you'd structurally damage the artery so much that it would just collapse. And so you'd have this acute closure, and they'd literally have to whisk people off from the cath lab to open heart surgery to, repair the artery, because there's just really nothing else you could do at that point in time. So the stent was there to solve that problem. So the stent was a metal scaffold that would keep the artery open. So if you crack the artery with the balloon and it collapsed, there was a scaffold there to keep the artery open. Well, then that was great. That took the failure of angioplasty from, I don't know, maybe 35, 40% down to, 20, 25%. But that created a new problem. The body's like, well, this stainless steel is not supposed to be there, and a scar grows over top of the stent. And lo and behold, the stent closes at 30 days or 60 days because of scarring and restenosis. So then drug-coated stents were designed to solve that problem. And then when drug-coated stents solved that problem, we had a problem with clotting. And it just was this, we kept going down from, 40% to, 20%. Drug-coated stents got to 1 or 2%, and then, and so on and so forth. But every time we solved the problem, there seemed to be a new one that emerged. Although, the success rate kept going up and up and up, which is why they were so successful. But it's been this never-ending evolution of trying to create a new solution for the new problem you created with your last invention, right?
And to that end, I'm curious, given your perspective and all the experience, there had been some evaluation and investigation and desire to see whether or not bioabsorbable stents could therefore then be the next step in terms of addressing potential issues down the road. Do you have a perspective of whether or not we'll get back to that for treating coronary artery disease?
Yeah, it's and that creates a whole new. So we experimented with those polymers as well, and there's pros and cons, and like everything in biology, I think there'll be an area that it works for, and an area that perhaps it's less for. But and my knowledge is antiquated now because I haven't worked in the field for a while, but the issue was that, yes, it was great. If you could get rid of the stent, then you got rid of the foreign body, which meant that you got rid of the stimulus for restenosis. So perfectly logical. And in some cases, that appears to work. In other cases, what would happen, though, is that, remember, the stent was still there forming a scaffold function. And if the artery hadn't completely healed and remodeled itself in an open configuration, and you took away the structure, you then were faced with this, potential problem of what was going on. And second, if the stent stayed on the surface, those polymers, if you think, most of them are what are called surface eroding polymers. And if you think about when you're a kid and you have those suckers that you would suck on, the kind of classic things, they get thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner as you surface erode them, if you will. But eventually they get so fragile they break. And of course, an artery is pulsating, 60, 80 times a minute. And so, there was always the potential that if they weren't buried in the wall, then these polymer flakes could, break off and become embolic agents. And so, again, every time you solve a problem, you created the potential for a new one. Although, what I've seen, and I advise for a company that I think is doing some really cool work in neurological stenting with a degradable stent. I think there's going to be some clear places where it totally makes sense and is very, very useful. But it's always been this yin and yang of the law of unintended consequences when you work in these areas.
Yeah, and most of the time it's unpredictable unintended consequences. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm curious, looking back, drug-eluting stents would go on to be one of the most rapidly adopted technologies ever commercialized in the medical device MedTech industry. What did working on that transition teach you about what separates incremental innovation from true platform level changing medicine?
Yeah, I take no credit for that product launch. It was Boston Scientific and Jim Tobin who really drove that. But if I'm not mistaken, I think we took 70% of the world market in 70 days. It was absolutely astounding. And what I learned about that is the need to have the courage to go all in. Boston Sci, who's obviously the 800-pound gorilla now, was the number 4 stent company when drug-coated stents started out. I mean, Guidant and Medtronic were, the winners, if you will, of the bare metal stent market. And Boston Sci really had that kind of underdog mentality, right? I mean, there's always a very big difference with working with a market leader versus working with somebody who wants to become the market leader. And they were willing to change their platform as well. Like, their bare metal platform had not been overly competitive, which is why they were number 4, and they were working towards changing the platform. At the same time, they were adding drug coating to it, and they went all in and built manufacturing capability to actually supply the market if they were that successful, which was a huge risk and a huge investment. And so, you know, there's no point taking 70% of the market if you can only manufacture to, 10 or 15% of the market. So they took so many risks to be there, and that they were able to meet that need just kind of shows that, if you're really serious about truly disrupting a market, you have to invest ahead of time. You have to dare to be right. Because if you miss it, and you catch the tiger by the tail, but you can't actually scale to meet it, you may lose a lot of customers, or you may lose your lead, in the year or two it might take you to catch back up. So it takes a lot of courage, takes a lot of, you've got to be willing to not just be right, but potentially be horribly wrong, if you're going to do that. And I think that's what I learned. It doesn't matter how big your company is. When you get to these transformational type technologies, it's still a bet the company type situation, or at least, for the people in charge, it's a bet your career type piece. And healthcare is I love baseball, so I always say that healthcare is a home run hitter's game, right? I
Nice.
mean, if you're going for it, you have to be willing to walk back to the dugout having struck out a bunch of times.
Yeah.
But when you make contact, it's a beautiful thing, and you really have to have that mentality. I think even if you're running a big healthcare company, you still have to be willing to take a significant amount of chance and risk if you want to, you know, be number one.
Right. Well, and you should certainly have demonstrated courage in terms of leaning into smart implants long before it was even a broader industry conversation. You were building towards this future. Was there an original insight that convinced you that this category would eventually matter?
Yeah, and I've walked back to the dugout, struck out a few times too. Believe me. Um, you know, uh, no, I look at the probably the two things that I've invested most of my life into, and they were relatively simple and straightforward insights, right? The premise behind Angiotech was not rocket science. We didn't invent some new molecular pathway or some Nobel Prize winning piece of biology. The insight was medical devices get infected, they get inflamed, right? They get overgrown by tissue, and pharmaceutical companies make things called anti-infectives and anti-inflammatories and anti-proliferative agents. So why don't we put them together? And why don't we make a bioactive implant? Now, at the time, that sounded pretty crazy. Now that sounds incredibly logical, but it wasn't a huge scientific insight. Now, there was a lot of technology that went into that. You had to do polymeric drug delivery. You had to do a whole bunch of things you couldn't possibly imagine. But I don't think the insight was, you know, book my flight to Stockholm kind of thing. It's a pretty straightforward. When I think about Canary, it's also pretty straightforward, right? I mean, this thing knows where it is on the planet. It can orient itself. It can, take all kinds of readings. How come this thing can't. And the technology certainly existed. Again, we didn't have to invent the drugs that we put onto the devices. We didn't have to invent the sensors. We didn't have to invent, the transmission technology or the power technology or anything like that. And so I think the insight itself was fairly obvious. And, my sense is that 10 years from now, it'll be kind of a given that most medical devices will provide some sort of feedback to the patients and the clinicians. So it's really just, I guess, getting to the obvious conclusion before everybody else gets to the obvious conclusion.
Right. And the applicability for sensing and understanding is wide open throughout the entire human body. And coming from the cardiac world, you landed on orthopedics as the first application. How did that unfold?
That again was not by design. I always felt, having spent 20 years working on stents, that if you could build a stent that could tell you whether it was open or closed, you'd take 70% share in 70 days as well. Uh, you know, an angiogram is an expensive and potentially hazardous way to figure out whether an artery is open or not. And if you were able to do that, by holding your phone up like this, that would be a blockbuster product. The problem was the technology wasn't there yet. The power sources weren't available to do that. The sensor capability was not small enough, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the technology will get there, but when we started doing this, in 2012, the technology was nowhere near that. And so the only thing we could make was, the size of a AAA battery to have power and sensing and transmission capability. And the only device big enough to take it was a total knee. So it was, out of necessity that we went into orthopedics first. We now have a cardiac program that's, fairly advanced in pivotal trials, trying to do non-invasive pulmonary artery pressure monitoring. But that was only after the technology had moved forward for a full decade. And I suspect, were we to have this conversation 10 years from now, the capabilities of all of those would allow us to get into smaller and smaller and more, intricate device designs. But in the beginning, we went with the only thing we were actually capable of building.
Right. And as you evaluated orthopedic medicine, was there anything that surprised you about, the practices or the workflow?
It's really different. Really different. To the point where I'd say that nothing I learned in cardiology has helped me in orthopedics. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I have a theory, which is strictly a theory, and I have no idea if this is even true, but this is my theory. When I think back over interventional cardiology, so, I graduated medical school in 1992. The cardiac surgeons are still the king of the world. It's all bypass and open heart valves and all that. And I think of the evolution of interventional cardiology in the space of my career. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's not just stents. It's like, if you had told me you were going to do valve replacements off of a catheter back then, and you were going to close septal defects, and you were going to core out the artery, you're going to use sound waves to break plaque. I mean, the pure innovation in cardiology has been breathtaking. And what that means is that the cardiologist has been kind of conditioned to accept innovation, right? Because a lot of this stuff started off kind of clunky, but it got better and better and better and better. Classic disruptive business theory, Clay Christensen stuff, start good enough and just get better and better and better. And so cardiologists have had this nonstop series of innovation, which means they're early adopters of technology. They are receptive to new technology. If you go to a cardiologist and you do a study that says, this treatment's better than that treatment, they will adopt it quickly. So the flip side of that 70% in 70 days is that cardiologists had to be willing to change their practice relatively quickly as well. And so I think that was because they were in a very technology-driven field. I look at orthopedics, and orthopedics is very interested in technology, robotics and AR, VR and all this stuff. They're very interested in data. It's not like, they get a bad rap for, hammers and saws, but they are actually very technology forward. But I'm not sure technology has had the same impact in their business. If you look at implants from 25, 30 years ago, their success rates aren't all that different than the ones that were put in yesterday. If you look at robotics, it has an impact, but not a huge impact. It's not like, total knees went from, having a 20% patient dissatisfaction rate to a 1%. It was kind of like 20% to 19 to 18. Anyways, moral of the story is, I think the innovation in orthopedics has been more incremental. It's not like if I missed this, there was a dramatic change in patient outcome. And I've heard a lot of orthopedic surgeons say, don't be first, but don't be last, which is, these innovations haven't had transformational effects. They've had incremental effects. And what that means is the orthopedic surgeons have not been huge early adopters of technology. And so what I've seen in orthopedics is that it's very much a more graduated and thoughtful introduction of technology. There's not a huge rush to the new thing
Yeah.
because in the past they haven't seen massive benefits from the new thing.
Was that something you flagged as you did your assessment of the market in terms of bringing new technology to the space, or is that something that you just discovered as you went
No,
about your process?
that's the school of hard knocks. We went out and we said, hey, we think data is going to make a really significant difference. We think we can do X, Y, and Z, and people were like, fantastic, come talk to me when you have the proof.
Right.
In interventional cardiology, like, well, how can I participate in this study? Very, very different type of approach.
Yeah. And so now you have the proof your initial application has been in total knee replacement, as you mentioned. You've accumulated a significant amount of data. What has been the clinical power you've observed in having smart implants?
It's really made me think about how these technologies evolve. Um, you know, when you first start collecting data from any type of implant or wearable, or it doesn't even matter what it is, but when you first start collecting longitudinal data, uh, you really become initially a monitoring company. The only thing you can do is collect, um, and so you start out as a monitoring company. And if you look at the evolution of digital health, and you kind of go back to the first monitoring devices, it was all about the RPM codes. It was all about remote patient monitoring, and that's where people got started. Then, if you're fortunate enough to get enough patients, where you get thousands or tens of thousands of patients, then you become a bit of a diagnostic company. So you have enough data now to interpret it. Once you know what normal is, you start to be able to identify abnormal, and you start to be able to see changes. I'm fond of using the ECG analogy. Like, imagine if you developed ECG, on day one. The first thing you'd do is you'd just be able to monitor people, but you wouldn't know what a normal ECG was. But once you had enough that you knew what a normal ECG was, then you could see abnormal ECGs, and you could start to say, oh, when I see this particular pattern, that's an infection. When I see this particular pattern, that's heart failure or whatever. And so you become a diagnostic company because you're able to tell the difference between normal and abnormal. And then, something I'm sure we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. The next step is, can I become a predictive company? So do I
Right.
have enough data? So back to the ECG analogy, can I find silent ischemia before the MI? So can I see those sentinel changes before the problem, so I have the opportunity to intervene, you know, a priori. And I think that's what we have started to find. Our first things were kind of, hey, we got all this data, not sure what it means, but we can tell you how they're doing. Then we were like, okay, we now know what a normal recovery looks like, right? Until I know what the range of motion for a 55-year-old male on day 17 is, I have no idea if the next patient is ahead or behind where their expectation is. That gets me into the, hey, red light, green light, or diagnostic phase. And then eventually, can I know enough about this pattern of recovery to say this person's at risk for developing this problem, doing well, or conversely, this patient's heading on a normal trajectory and we can, leave them alone. And that's been kind of the evolution of the data pattern. And you kind of grow up with your data.
Right.
You can't get out in front of your data. You have to follow your data, and the state of your company and what you're able to do with it is dictated by the size of your and intricacy of your data asset.
Yeah. I love how you talk about those three phases, monitoring, diagnostic, and then eventually you want to get to predictive and preventative. I think our healthcare system as a whole, we do a pretty good job in the first two and not great in the third. Why is it so difficult for us to make that transition into predictive and preventative?
Um, with the caveat that I'm obviously horribly biased because I've spent like 12 or 14 years now working in this field. I, you can't you can't measure what you can't monitor, and you can't predict what you don't have. And if you look at medicine as a whole, we you know, as we evolved even from kind of clinical diagnosis to blood tests and x-rays and then to MRI and, and CT and all the rest, all of these were kind of post hoc phenomenon, right? So the patient presents, the patient already has the problem. And so our entire system was really diagnostically based, right? So the idea was to, narrow down the infinite to the probable and then institute the right treatment. We didn't really have that kind of linear data that you needed. I think the reason I always use ECG or specifically actually Holter monitoring is that was really kind of the first time we had this ability to send somebody home and follow their patterns and start to understand what those patterns meant and identify kind of rare situations before they became complex situations. So I think medicine as a whole has been following that same pattern I just talked about, right? I mean, the first we could kind of monitor people, we could look at them, we could put a stethoscope on their chest, we could see how they were doing, and then we got tools that allowed us to diagnose them. And I think now we're starting not just with monitoring, but with AI and other things, we're starting to be able to predict. And I think medicine as a whole is going through that three-phase evolution, and we just happen to be fortunate enough to be part of it right now.
Yeah.
But it's really kind of a technological shift that's happening within medicine.
And so with the canary implants, what are some of the things that you feel as though we're starting to be able to predict or can predict or in the short future will be able to predict?
Yeah, I'd put those into probably three buckets.
Yeah.
Initially, we were obviously very orthopedic centered. Orthopedic surgeons are concerned about orthopedic complications. So they're concerned about MUAs and infections and stiffness and pain and limping and falling and things like that. And so our device was, heavily weighted towards looking at things like range of motion or cadence or stride length and using kind of gait parameters to address gait abnormalities. And I would say 90% of our effort went into that very early on. Then kind of as we evolved through that, we looked at why people go back to hospital and we looked at why people went to the emergency room. And it turns out that only half the time it was for orthopedic problems. The other half of the time it was for medical problems. So, obviously many of these patients have comorbidities. They have diabetes, they have COPD, they have, heart failure. And you give them an anesthetic and you put them through a complex procedure, and to nobody's surprise, they come back to the hospital because they have atelectasis or pneumonia or cardiac decompensation. And so then we realized that, hey, we collect things like step count and walking speed and things that can be used as global parameters of overall health.
Right.
And this isn't of academic interest. And, I'm sure we can talk about this later as well, but with this whole CJRX where the docs are going to be paid for the 90-day episode of care,
Right.
they're going to be responsible for those readmissions. And not all of them are orthopedic. So being able to identify the medical patients suddenly becomes really important. And the exciting thing, which we've only just scratched the surface, is something we didn't anticipate. Again, one of these law of unintended consequences. But, when we went to school, they taught us that there's a Parkinsonian gait and an Alzheimer's gait and a CHF gait and I worked with some really great emergency docs who could watch somebody walk from the waiting room in and go, acute asthma attack, congestive heart failure, right? Exactly like that. And, it turns out that there are gait changes associated with all those abnormalities. And when you get 100,000 patients, then you can see what a Parkinsonian gait looks like, or an evolving Alzheimer's gait looks like, or and so on and so forth, right? And so that I'm excited about as a law of unintended consequences, where gait can be a biomarker, not just for the acute recovery from TKA, but is this a biomarker we can use in disease states going forward? And I think all that speaks to is that if you can collect a physiologic data stream that's meaningful, you can do an awful lot of things with it. And, clearly, not to jump into the hype, but if you can apply AI to that, you can do some things that, you know, would have been very hard to do in the absence of AI.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. I think Malcolm Gladwell in one of his books once talked about the referee at a tennis match and their ability to invariably predict if someone was going to have a foot fault, which is sort of a rare event in a
Yep.
tennis match, especially at the professional level.
Yes.
And you would have these long-term refs be able to say, "Oh, that player's going to have a foot fault," and sure enough, they would have it. But they wouldn't be able to explain what they were observing or seeing that allowed them to make that prediction.
Yes.
Sounds very similar to what you're talking about in terms of gait and being able to say, okay, that patient likely has asthma or CHF or what have you.
Yes. And, to extend that analogy, if you look at professional tennis players, they're already moving to return of serve before the racket even makes contact,
Right.
because they've recognized the pattern as to whether or not the ball's going to end up forehand or backhand on them. And in fact, if they wait for the ball to actually be hit, they can't get to it.
Right.
Um, and that's what you see. The Pre-Galan Awards are kind of industry's Nobels, if you will, that go through things, and I've gone to them the last couple of years, and one of the winners I thought was quite fascinating, where they had looked at hundreds of thousands of ECGs, and they were able to use AI to diagnose the cardiomyopathies that are not diagnosable by ECG. And, because the AI was able to see a pattern in those ECGs that was beyond sitting there with calipers and, and measuring and doing, like, the original AI that figured out ECG, which was the human brain. And so, having these patterns and uncovering these patterns and the rest, I think, are, really fascinating next steps. There was a big study in Europe where they looked at patients' health records, and they, just by looking at, it was a very influential paper in Nature, and just by looking at, if you saw the doctor for this and then you had that diagnostic test and you just followed that, that was predictive of you 20 years later ending up with disease X or Y, right? And so these early pattern recognitions before the fact, I think that's going to be Nobel winning science, actually, but very fascinating, just these linear data streams. And back to your initial question, I think that's what was missing before. We had these snapshots, we had x-rays, we had blood tests, we had these single moments in time.
Right.
But we lacked these kind of linear data sets. And so the more linear data sets we collect, the higher the probability that we're going to be able to predict.
Right. But you have to go through those steps of monitor, diagnose, and then predict and
And then
prevent.
predict.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
That's
Yep.
fascinating. And I would imagine with your assessment of gait, part of the thinking was maybe we could predict the potential that the patient is going to have a fall, but
Yes.
then you've been able to expand the universe. Is that kind of where it started?
Yeah. I mean, when I first talked to orthopedic surgeons, they said, if you can tell me if a patient is infected or is about to get infected, or you can give me advance notice, I wouldn't use any other device. So I think we were like, all right, let's focus on infection. And maybe someday we'll succeed in doing that. We're starting to see some patterns associated with that. But it's also the hardest thing to do, because infection is, a 1% incidence, and mathematicians will tell you need, 10,000 patient records before you're even going to have anywhere near enough numbers to take a sniff at doing that type of work. And since patients are lost to follow-up and blah, anyways, you do the math, you get into like 100,000 patients by the time you can do that. And so what I think happens, again, you follow your data, not the other way around, is that common things occur commonly, and you see those things first. So stiffness is the most common complication of TK. Not everybody has a manipulation, an MUA as a result of it, but it's a common problem. So you see stiffness first, and then you see, things like risk of ED readmission or risk of thing, because 15% of people go to the ED, so it happens fairly commonly. So you start to see the brain, and then you find the stuff that happens 5% of the time, 1% of the time, and then you find the rarer and rarer events. And so, while if I was doing classic product design, my market research would have said, if I can find infection, I'm going to have a home run product. That wasn't going to happen right away. So we've had to kind of crawl, walk, run our way towards bigger and more impactful insights, just by getting the necessary data in place to do it. So it is a bit of a leap of faith when you get started. You have to trust that the data is going to lead you somewhere, and you take the risk that it might not.
Yeah. And how many patients now have some form of a Canary implant?
We're well over 20,000 now. So we are, we just submitted an algorithm for DVT. So we're now getting into the rarer events. We're submitted an algorithm for stiffness. We've submitted an algorithm for risk of hospital readmission. And the goal here is not perfection. The goal is a flag that says, this patient is at risk of, right? And the way I explain it to clinicians is like, look, if I see an elevated white count, that doesn't tell me whether the patient has a pyelonephritis or a pneumonia. It tells me the patient has an infection, and clinical judgment. What it does is it tells me which questions to ask so I can get to the correct answer, right? So, if we see these changes, that doesn't mean the patient's going to have a DVT or this patient is going to be readmitted, but it flags them as not progressing according
Yes.
to normal, which should trigger you to ask the questions, do you have a fever? Does it hurt when you pee? That will help you tease out what the data means, right? There's still an interpretive part of all of this, but it is quite fascinating. You can start to see, as my head data scientist says, when you have your knee replaced, everybody starts by not walking very much. Everybody's stiff. Everybody limps. But those who are going to get better go this way, and those who don't go flat. And mathematically, these people start to separate as early as 2 or 3 weeks. And so even though they might not be back in the ER until day 45 or day 50, right? You're starting to see the separation of those curves fairly early. And the higher the numbers, the better the math, the earlier you can push back that, early warning signal.
Yeah. And so you're generating more and more data. We're getting closer to becoming more and more predictive. How do you think about data ownership? I'm sure that's a conversation that's happening inside the company quite a bit.
Yeah, and we take two approaches. Legally in the United States, there's probably, I think, about 4 or 5 states now that say that it's the patient that owns the data. I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes somewhat universal over the next, few years. We've always taken the approach that it's the patient that owns the data, and I think medically that's the right way to do it. We have the good fortune that we can be fairly transparent with our data. You can't get our data unless you put this thing in. And so, we can be magnanimous because, the person who put it in, and, there's no data without our implants. So we have been taken care of by collecting the data in the first place. And that has meant that we, share our data with everybody. So we will share it with the hospitals. We share it with academic investigators. We let people probe our database for insights. We actually submitted 49 abstracts to AAOS and AUKUS last month. And many of those are not really smart knee related. They're just related to, if I give this drug, which outcome do I get? Like, does it affect range of motion or activity positively or negatively? And so we've been able to address some kind of basic science questions. So because of our business model, where it's not so much the data, but the device that's proprietary that allows us to get the data, has meant that we can, that we can make sure that it belongs to the patient. We don't have to hoard it. And two, we can share it, so people can gain insights from it, because, our business model allows us to do that.
Yes, yes. And so you're building this intelligence layer. It goes across multiple implant
Yep,
categories. That means that partner selection is a critical aspect of what you're doing. How do you value partners? Because in a lot of cases, you're the intelligence layer that goes inside of another technology or inside of
that's right.
another device, right?
Yeah, I mean, for those who haven't seen our stuff before, where we've evolved to is basically building little cartridges so that they can slide into an existing medical device to convert it from a regular device to a smart implant. And that gives us the flexibility in terms of, do we work with one party? Do we work with everybody? And as I've thought about that from a business perspective, I've come out in a way that probably isn't superficially obvious, but is when you think about it. So I categorize medical devices into proprietary and commoditized. And I don't mean that in the sense that everybody else does, but whether it's patented or not patented. I'm What I mean is, there are definitely proprietary devices, and by that, yes, sometimes they're patented, but the commercialization and development of that is a very, very sophisticated endeavor, right? I mean, I wouldn't start a knee company. You need all kinds of tools, you need lots of sales reps, you need all kinds of, ancillary equipment and robots and all kinds of other things to be a knee company. It's just too big. I feel the same way about coronary stents. You need catheters and guide wires and balloons and imaging and IVUS and who knows what else, right? And so if the device is very complicated or it's part of a very complicated ecosystem, then partnership's probably the way for us to go. But then there are devices where, that matters less. I don't think orthopedic surgeons care much about their intermedullary nails or their screws or their hardware. And, you know, in those situations, the best device is the one that the doc would prefer to use, and the label on the package doesn't matter all that much to them. And in those situations, I feel like we can develop them ourselves, because we don't need a sales force to teach people how to use an intermedullary nail or how to use an interbody cage. And so if we had a smart cage, they could integrate it into whatever it is they're doing, and that allows us to go it alone, because the serial partnership model is a very, very difficult model
Yeah.
to
Right.
run.
Right.
And so you do need to have a couple of things that you keep yourself, where you control your own destiny, because, your partner, even with the best intentions, may have a different objective in their business at some point in your partnership than you do. And so I want to make sure that, yes, we have a partnership portfolio in these kind of high tech, high touch type interventions, but I also want to make sure that we have some standalone devices that we can develop and ourselves and control our own future.
Yeah. It's nearly impossible to keep incentives fully aligned all the way through over multiple years, and priorities change over time, et cetera. Um, yeah. So one of the places you've been advancing quite a bit is in spine, and you've received an FDA breakthrough designation in spine. Beyond that headline of receiving breakthrough, what does this change for Canary and what you're examining in the spine area?
Yeah, so we have thought a lot about what are the right markets, and one thing I've learned about market research is that it's very product specific. I don't think it's a formula. as much as some of the consultants in the world might lead you to believe. And what we've learned about our technology is that you need a device that has a reasonably high failure rate. And part of that is mathematical. If something fails 50% of the time, it's going to take far less patients to start to figure out why than if it fails 1% of the time. The second, of course, is clinical need. Like, people are going to pay more and be more interested in procedures that have high patient dissatisfaction rates, and there's more pricing pressure there because complications cost money, and that gives you the ability to prevent complications. I mean, the reason we sold so many stents is we took the failure rate from 25% down to 1%, and the cost of failure was very, very high, and so we could capture some of that value in the pricing of our device. So spine is attractive because 40-50% of people are unhappy with their outcomes. Secondly, as a spinal surgeon said to me, you could send the same patient to 11 docs and get 11 different diagnoses and 20 different surgical approaches. And so it's also interesting because having objective data to help standardize procedure or approach or things like that are quite valuable. You'll see in some of the abstracts that we just submitted in TKA, we're starting to look at, if I do the surgery this way versus that way, what happens, so those are kind of where you want to go. Spine really ticks all of those boxes. We have breakthrough for hip, knee, shoulder, spine, and revision, but we went into knee first because knees fail a lot more than hips. And so, most hip patients are actually really quite satisfied. So going after, that group would be a lot more difficult. And to me, spine is kind of one of the holy grails of orthopedics because, it really is a procedure that's obviously very, very necessary, but there's still a lot of question marks associated with it.
Yeah. So these domains and spaces where maybe it's primarily driven by art and finding a way to make it science, taking the
Exactly.
subjective and making it objective.
Yeah, once we got to drug-coated stents, it was hard to go higher. I mean, once we got to kind of 1% failure rates, like you're talking pretty big studies to go to 0.5% or a quarter, right? Whereas, when we went from bare metal stents, it was a much bigger target to go after. And so as I look at where we can go with these, because quite honestly, almost every medical device, there's probably an engineering way to attach sensors to it one way or another. Um, you need to look for those areas where there's a significant dissatisfaction or unmet medical need.
So after everything, Angiotech, Canary, more than 200 patents and applications, what's a problem in medicine that you're still eager to solve?
You know, I I think this will be my last rodeo, although I've been wrong every time I've said that before. I I'm really enjoying this. It's been really, really hard. We talked about this when I first met you. Funding in MedTech has been incredibly difficult the last little while. Um, the MedTech companies, when I first started out, there was a whole group of middle class companies, right? So there were companies, you had the multinationals and the huge companies, but you had 20, 30 companies that were kind of mid-sized. And what that meant is that there was a lot of customers for new technologies and innovation, and you know, you you could partner with kind of a mid-tier company, that was ambitious, and they might partner with you fairly early because they wanted to get to the technology before the big boys got it, and the ecosystem was much more evolved. And now we really just have a small number of very big companies where, as a medtech entrepreneur, you now have to not only get approval, but you usually have to build revenues, and you have to have a significant amount of value before you've reached the threshold where you're interesting to a Boston Sci or a Medtronic or a Zimmer or a Stryker. Anyways, with that in mind, having just been through that again in my career and seeing how hard it is to go from idea to whatever, I'm pretty excited about this concept of linear data. And so I'm pretty excited about the concept of hopefully being entrepreneurial within Canary and going into different indications and going into different fields, as opposed to, coming up with a big idea and starting from scratch again. I think the wounds of the last 12 years are too deep. And I do feel like this whole thing has some run in it in terms of data. I know you feel the same way, and that's kind of a next logical frontier in medicine. I think I'm going to hang on for dear life and see how far I can go with it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think the applicability of linear data over so many different indications can be so powerful. So if
Mhm.
we were to fast forward 15 years from now, is there an aspect of medicine that you think will be commonplace that maybe sounds a little futuristic today?
Yeah, one of the things, and this may or may not sound crazy, but I and it's not Schwarzenegger and Terminator, but I do have this kind of concept as we think about hardware becoming sensor enabled and communicative. And, you know, as you get older, you accumulate more and more hardware. And I'm quite fascinated by this concept of almost like a central node, a central computing node that communicates with multiple aspects of the body. Um, you know, One of my professors always said to me that the problem with patient compliance is the patient, and these wearable technologies are all very, very good and very, very interesting. The problem is anytime you ask somebody to do something, you get a drop off. But I think monitoring will become less invasive and less involved. And I have this concept, or no, I don't, it's not my concept, but I have this feeling that, continuous blood pressure monitoring and respiratory and all these things are going to become commonplace, and relatively small subcutaneous uh, implants will be able to communicate with each other across the body and 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 provide kind of more holistic information going forward. And so yes, we're going to reach a sense of data overload for sure, but it's also going to be correspond to data processing capabilities that are probably beyond our imagination. And I do see this kind of monitoring continuously of multiple things across multiple parts getting more and more predictive. I remember reading a book years ago by Eric Schmidt at Google, and he, near the end of the book, asks the question, like, what will happen to your business when computing power becomes almost infinite and almost free? And we're getting close to that now.
Yeah.
And so I do think 10 years from now, you will see an awful lot of data gathering in many different forms for well patients, not just unhealthy patients. And you'll see a lot of computing power and a lot of insights being generated, um, you know, in the field. You know, when I was a kid, I learned how to fix my old TR6 so that every time it broke down, I could repair it on the road and continue to drive. Now I take my car in and it gets plugged into a laptop, and the diagnoses are done the same way. I think medicine will evolve a little bit along that timeline where, there'll be a kind of a data source that is used routinely when a patient walks into the emergency room. That was the vision behind EMR, was that we'd have this continuous data set. Well, I think we'll have a matching data set of kind of continuous monitoring and continuous physiologic insights that will plug in when you walk into the ER, that will help fill in the gaps
Yeah.
diagnostically and
Yeah.
prognostically.
And to think then you have a data interpretation layer on top of that is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and 10 years ago, I mean, what did it? How many billions of dollars did it take to sequence the human genome?
Yeah.
in 2000, right? Now it's a couple $100.
Yeah.
So 10 years from now, all that genomic information, all that, hereditary information, all that predictive information, I think will be carried around with us. And for those of us in MedTech, I do believe that direct source feedback will become very, very important. I mean, the one thing about MedTech is that it is very much a site-specific solution. Like when
Yes.
you make a pill, it goes through the entire body,
Body.
but when you put in a coronary stent, you're only concerned about that much of artery. That's it. That's the only thing you care about is what's going on in that part of the artery. And so I think in MedTech, the expectation that there will be data sources, accurate data sources, diagnostic data sources from pretty much everything that we put into human beings, I think that has to become a reality in the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started the conversation, and you give a lot of great insight about how important it was that you were kind of almost bedside as you started to evaluate drug-eluting stents. We have a lot of clinicians who are
Mhm.
considering being entrepreneurs who
Yep.
listen to this podcast. Any advice for other clinicians who are considering moving into a career focused on building innovations?
Yeah, my oldest child, my daughter's an R2 in emergency medicine right now, and she's been very, very interested in using AI to look at patterns of when people come into the emergency room, and they follow very specific economic patterns, socioeconomic patterns, and different things as well. And the advice I give to her and to clinicians is that continuing medical education was always important, clinically. But if you have an entrepreneurial bent, stay apprised of what's happening in all the other things, whether they be engineering or computer science or whatever. And what I think has changed a lot since when I went through medical school is I'm seeing a lot of people who finish their medical degrees, then do a graduate degree, and then do a residency, and they're doing things like AI and computer science and all kinds of other things. And so, long-winded way of saying, if you have an area of interest that you think can attach to medicine, pursue it. Um, get involved with it. Uh, the way that it's been done, at least for the foreseeable future, I think it's going to continue to be that way, which is that, if you can affiliate with solid researchers outside your field and you happen to be able to link into an academic institution that gives you access to, great minds in the area of expertise that you need, collaborate, get involved. I think it's going to be a lot harder to be an idea doc who just goes in the garage and comes up with a new catheter design or something. That will still happen, but I think that's getting a lot harder than when I started. And I think it's now becoming more of these integrated teams. And as a physician, you bring a very important piece to that puzzle. You bring that clinical view, that what works, that what doesn't. Workflow is incredibly important. I don't think if you didn't practice medicine, I don't think you could ever understand the importance of workflow or how to deal with it. And so, I think these kind of multidisciplinary teams, even though we've been talking about those for 25 years, I think though they are becoming more and more important. And I think you should honor your medical training and understand the value that it brings into that, and use it to collaborate and get involved with these programs as they come along, because I think the next 10 years will be absolutely explosive
Yeah,
for medical development, more
absolutely.
than more than I've seen in the 30 years before.
Wow. Absolutely. Well, great perspective and great advice. It's been a tremendous conversation. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspectives and your experiences. And I know everyone in the audience really appreciates it as well.
My pleasure. It was a lot of fun. It was great meeting you at LSI and all that came out of it. So appreciate you for having me.
Absolutely. And we'll be following the Canary story here very closely. And thanks to all of you for joining today on Powering the Future Within. If this conversation inspired you, please share it with your MedTech community. Stay inspired and keep innovating.